Hi, everybody. I'm very excited for today. I'm Ken Moffat. I'm the Jack Layton Chair. This event is brought to you by the Jack Layton Chair. We will begin, however, before we begin the proceedings, we'll begin with Lorena Ryan, who will do the land acknowledgement today. Lorena.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here today. If we were meeting in person, we would be able to acknowledge the land that we are collectively gathering on to learn today together. Instead, as we are all joining virtually, we will be acknowledging the land where I and the Layton Chair are situated. We continue this practice because as we are all treaty people, we have a responsibility to honor Indigenous people, ongoing kinship to the land, and to be reminded of our treaty obligations. I am joining from Toronto, located in Treaty 13, William Treaty and Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon speak to the land that covers the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway. This treaty, initially between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, bound each nation to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent non-Indigenous people have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. This treaty, which represents our shared land as the Dish, carries three important teachings. First, that we live our lives, we never take more than what we need. Secondly, we ensure that we leave something in the dish for others. And thirdly, we keep the dish clean so that future generations may benefit from its medicine. At the Jack Layton Chair, we endeavor to take action to work together, troubling colonial relationships throughout our programming, engagement, and reimagining the university and community relationships that we can create. Thank you for being here and have a good day. I'll send you back to Ken.
Thank you, Lorena.
You're welcome.
A few words about the Layton Chair. Jack Layton taught in politics at our university and became the leader of the opposition in the federal level of government here in Canada. He was an advocate for a social justice approach to governance. Within the broad spirit of Jack Layton, we're able to easily keep up the intent of Jack Layton in politics. The Jack Layton Chair is in its 9th year. It seeks to promote civic engagement of students, the collaboration of the university and community, promotion of equity and diversity, and a transdisciplinary approach to both our subjectivity and our attachment to social change, but also knowledge. I'm now going to introduce Nadia Burton, who is the Associate Dean in the Faculty of Community Services, who is bringing greetings.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure if it's afternoon. We'll call it afternoon, barely. It's really an honor to be asked to welcome you all here on behalf of the Faculty of Community Services Dean's Office. FCS, as we call ourselves, Faculty of Community Services, is both proud and honored that we're one of the homes for the Jack Layton Chair in Social Justice, which is actually a collaborative partnership between the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Community Services at this university. It's the kind of collaboration that we relish and that really, I think, supports and strengthens the work that we're able to do both within the institution and beyond its walls. And I would say as a faculty, FCS, whose heart lies really with rigorous research and with social change commitments, and with deep engagement with community, the work of the Jack Layton Chair and the work that Ken does, bringing along all of his collaborators, is something that we really treasure and we're tremendously proud to support. The kinds of cross and transdisciplinary conversations, the engagement with justice and with complex social and political issues, and the intellectual kind of reflection and practice brought to bear on these issues always make for outstanding events run by Ken. Events that really capture the entwined nature of theory and practice, that engage both the academy and the communities that lend meaning to our work. And they're events that help us think about meaningful moments in the lived experiences of all of us here and of the communities that we're part of and that we work with and alongside. Personally, I'll also just say that thinking about pleasure as a form of practice and the relationship of pleasure to social change and caring work or community practice that's really at the heart of all of our schools and the Faculty of Community Services is extremely compelling and perhaps in this moment crucial. So I'm very eager to hear the ideas that are going to be shared today. So a really warm welcome to everyone who's here with us, and a tremendous gratitude to our speakers for the thinking and reflection that you're going to be sharing with us. I know today's talks are going to engage and challenge and probably stretch us, and what a wonderful gift that is. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Just a few comments of thanks. The chair is supported, as was mentioned, by the Dean of Community Services and also the Dean of Arts and the Office of the President here. And we're thankful for that support. The university is in a moment of change over its name. It has been known as Ryerson University, and a number of us are also calling it X University while we go through this change. I'd also like to thank some individuals: Lorena Ryan, Sarah Firmley, Keegan Hobson, and Luke Nader, who have worked to support bringing this event today. The event: we welcome you to Practice of Pleasure, Social Justice Approaches to the Helping Professions. You're in for a treat with Ricky Varghese and William Gooding. I don't know why I called you Golding, William, but there you go. William Gooding, who are both, I've seen them both as educators and are incredible educators and practitioners. So as mentioned, this is timely in the time of COVID. We're going to hear about the central importance of COVID, of pleasure during this time, and how to imagine healing practices or helping practices that also consider social change. The presenters are steeped in community practice as well as theorizing, and they will be in conversation with myself. Sarah, before we introduce the speakers, do you mind talking a few housekeeping points?
Yeah, absolutely. So nice, and we're so happy to see everyone today. We also keep in mind that everyone's coming from many different places today, and we're so happy that you can join us. If you would like to put in where you're coming from in today, feel free to put it in the chat, and we'd love to see that. Also, just a few housekeeping tips. So for Q&A, we are going to be having that towards the end. So we won't be answering questions necessarily while we're having the discussion. However, feel free to mention your questions in the chat. And you can also, towards the end during the Q&A session, you can also keep your, you can turn your camera back on and put your hand up. And keeping that in mind, we would love it if you could keep your cameras off while we're having the discussion with Ricky and William. And then when we have the Q&A session, you can feel free to join in and put your hand up or mention any questions you have in the chat. And yeah, and thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you, Sarah. I will now introduce Ricky and William. And I will be working from notes. Ricky Varghese is the Tanis Doe Postdoctoral Fellow in Gender Disability and Social Justice at the School of Disability Studies. He's working on the relationship between masculinity, suicidality, and death drive, as well as a collection entitled Sex and the Pandemic. In addition to being a researcher and an art writer, he runs a private practice in downtown Toronto since 2014. He's in the final stages of psychoanalytic training at the Toronto Institute for Psychoanalysis. Well, welcome, Ricky. William Gooding identifies as queer, HIV positive, Indigenous European person of Quechua, Spanish, and Irish descent. William is the National Director of the Feast Center for Indigenous Sexually Transmitted Blood-Borne Infection Research, working with Indigenous communities to support Indigenous and decolonizing methods for Indigenous individuals and communities living with and affected by STBBI. William has over 20 years of practice experience in HIV education, prevention, and care for racialized and economically disadvantaged youth and incarcerated men, both here in Canada as well as in the United States. William is a graduate of our MSW program here, and he completed his PhD at McMaster University. So welcome both Ricky and William. So let's go into the interview. This will be set up as an interview rather than a formal presentation with some guided questions for both Ricky and William. So if I might, as I've said, I think of you both as educators and public intellectuals in a manner, in that you do think through conceptual ideas while also having them steeped in direct practice and many years of practice. So at times we might discuss things quite abstract, but I know they're born out of direct experience. And that'll be part of our journey today. So this combination of practice and theory, as you keep hearing, is well suited to the intent of the chair and its location somewhere between university and community. And I'm hoping we'll speak to all audiences. I know we have prof students, we have staff members and community members. And again, people feel free to put in chat where you're from if you wish. So as we started preparing for this, we discovered there was this underlying interest for both of you in including pleasure and desire as part of the language of helping. So we're going to build to that. I mean, that's where we want to arrive. But at first, I think I would just like to ask you each to describe your practice and who you work with or who you have worked with in the past. Do you want to go first, William?
Sure. As you stated, right now I'm working as the National Director of the Feast Center for Indigenous STBBI Research. So the communities that I'm working with now are like First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities across Canada, and really focusing on the use of Indigenous methods, Indigenous knowledges, to think through and to conceptualize and create interventions and research that sort of meets Indigenous needs. So that's where I am now. Prior to that, I've done again, around like 20 years of like work in the HIV/AIDS field in Philadelphia, Vancouver, and Toronto. Most of that work was around HIV/AIDS prevention. And then more recently, I volunteered for like a period of time with ACT, working as a buddy for someone living with late stage AIDS, which was interesting in a way that it sort of like shifted a lot of my orientations around sort of what I'd been doing and sort of thinking, and especially being HIV positive myself, right? It sort of allowed for a new way of kind of thinking through that work and a way of thinking through the importance of pleasure. Yeah, and I'll just leave it there.
Ricky.
So I have a couple of different professional and kind of intellectual backgrounds. and it's kind of a little all over the place, but it kind of makes sense in my own mind. And then I'm right now, at present, I am Tanis Doe Postdoctoral Fellow in Gender, Disability, and Social Justice at the School of Disability Studies at Ryerson. And as Ken said, I'm also a private practitioner, as in I have a private practice as a psychotherapist. And I've been having this private practice for the last almost 8 years. And I just finished my training to become a psychoanalyst, actually, about a month ago. So that's also something that I've been doing for the last 4 years. But before all of that, before my private practice, before my postdoc, my background and my training is I was a social worker, and I worked primarily with people with HIV and AIDS, but I also did school social work, as in I worked with, as a school social worker in the Toronto District School Board, and I primarily did anti-homophobia education. So I used to work with kids as young as 4, 5, and all the way up until high school. In my private practice right now, I only work with adults, and I work with a very wide range of populations. Straight, queer, cis, trans, people of color, students, academics, activists, artists. So it's a pretty diverse population that I can work with. I don't really focus on any one particular population in my private practice, but my practice is informed by psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theory. And they'll talk a bit more about what that means down the line. One other aspect of my practice, if you want to call it, is that as Ken said, I also have a practice as an art writer, as in I write about art. I've had a very long-standing interest in art and aesthetics and visual representation, specifically around HIV/AIDS. And so I've written quite extensively about artists who specifically have worked on representing HIV/AIDS in different mediums, whether it's video art or film or other mediums. And so that has also played a part in how I understand my practice as a therapist, my interest in the arts. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. All three of us share an interest in art, actually, art and practice, and this might be a little off script for you guys, but what if we talk about that a little bit? Do you mind talking about why art? How is that tied into practice? How do you use it? What informs you in terms of using it? Because I know, William, you also share that interest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would say actually much of my scholarship has really grounded itself in the humanities, right? It's very much grounded itself in the arts, in visual art and film. I would say that one of the reasons that I sort of veer into that category, and I think it will get to that a little bit more when we begin discussing the use of like psychoanalytic theories and different approaches kind of connected to cultural studies is I'd suggest that they open up like other avenues for thinking through desire, for thinking through possibility that extends beyond how language is often like constituted and written. That there's ways in which a visual text allows and opens up like possibilities for feeling, which is quite different. Which is one of the reasons that I tend to kind of veer back to it, right? And think through about sort of its use, the framing, the way that it's even the modes in which it's sort of constituted or like thought through end up sort of allowing for a different way to kind of speak through ideas and speak through bodies. And I would say in relation to HIV, it's actually like it's a really rich place to think and to advocate and to theorize from.
Yeah. How about you, William? It's Ricky. How about you? You want to?
I think for me, so I mentioned that I have it labeled as a social worker, but I did my PhD in cultural studies, sociology and cultural studies, and so all and writing about art kind of started from there. And part of that was because I became very interested in sort of how art and visual representations of poetry or prose can come to tell stories about difficult, painful memories, historical memory, but also personal memory. And so art became a way to kind of understand the unspeakable or the unrepresentable, what you cannot represent in language. And so I became really compelled by how artists would represent loss, for example, around the AIDS crisis, in very, very compelling ways. And that became a way for me to really think about, alternative ways of thinking, sort of considering how we can talk about drama or loss. That doesn't necessarily fit kind of standard quantifiable ways, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's are there, thanks for that, and we'll probably come back to the notion of the unrepresentable. I think, we've talked in our preparation for this that even pleasure and desire at times become almost unrepresentable in the way we formally talk about our practices. Are there special concerns or possibilities, let's put it that way, in the communities within which you work? I heard, Ricky, your group of people you work with is quite complex. There's a lot of different people. Are there special concerns you'd like to talk about? Either of you? I just leave it open.
That's the reason why I'm pausing is I'm hesitant about exceptionalizing concerns.
Okay.
Just because I feel that the concerns that come up in my practice are layered and complex. So it's difficult to kind of speak about concerns without essentializing people per se. But as it all, I feel that concerns will probably come up in a more kind of organic manner.
Yeah.
I will say as well, just to add on to that, I think like in response to that question, just echoing what Ricky said, I think I also struggled a little bit with, okay, well, what can we, how can I define a set of concerns without generalizing, without sort of moving to this place of writing a community as being one way or having one thing. I do think as well, I think in relation to this, in relation to the question, of course, it depends on which community, at what point in time, in what location, what's the context, right? So I would say like in relation to the work that I'm doing now, colonialism is sort of deeply sort of impacting how indigenous peoples and settlers in this country have come to understand themselves, their relations to their bodies, their relations to each other, their relations to the land. The colonial project has been really central to how like we've all begun to kind of or not begun, how we've navigated and been sort of put into these boxes, right? Which determine like certain sort of ways of kind of engaging. Again, I say that, and also very much want to kind of like caution around that, right? So of course that's the overriding condition for like the present. And that overriding condition, of course, has like impacts on access to resources, you know, the legacy of the residential school system, the 60s scoop, higher rates of incarceration, police harassment, on and on and on. But I would like to say, along with that, I think what we miss sometimes when we talk about concerns for communities, and this also, let's say, with youth that I worked with in Philadelphia and in Toronto, is we don't focus enough on strengths. We don't focus enough on joy. We don't focus enough on pleasure. We don't focus on pleasure as a place of resistance, on joy as a place of possibility. Right. Yeah. So I think that I'd like to sort of hold those at the same time, right? That place of like thinking through pleasure and possibility is actually really integral, both to speaking back to those frames and to and beyond that, to just to what it means to actually be a living, breathing person in the world who's complex and who experiences like pleasure and joy in like a diversity of ways. So.
Yeah, it occurs to me, you know, as both of you talk, which is fantastic, is that this notion of concerns, yeah, right away becomes categorical, and categorical in a way then it represents communities. And as I hear you saying, William, it kind of creates a very particular frame, a troubling frame about how we talk about people.
Yeah, I want to add also, you know, most of the people who come to see me, most of my clients, they don't actually want to have concerns. They don't want to be bothered. They don't want to be concerned. They want to be free of concerns. And so part of a look at it is to kind of unpack that desire to not be bothered, not be affected, especially when there is so much to affect us. You know, there is, you know, police violence, there is colonialism, there's climate change, there's food shortages, there's economic precarity, there's so much to be concerned about, and that so many of us are looking for ways to mediate ourselves out of our concerns. And oftentimes that happens that by existing online or having different ways of finding community and finding solidarity with others. So concern, yeah, I mean, concern is a complicated category unto itself.
Did you have more to say, William? I saw you shaking your head.
I think I was really liking what I think Ricky was saying as a kind of an addendum to this notion of pleasure and joy, like in community, and its relation to kind of speaking back to what gets written as concerns, but also just again, as I was sort of saying before, just not only as a place of resistance, but also just as a place of of being in the world. That part of what actually makes us, be able to experience the world in a way that feels manageable, that feels good, is about having that access to the possibility of pleasure, right? So I think we're going to get to that a little bit later as well, right? Around sort of how who's imagined as actually having a right to pleasure, right? And who isn't, right? And how does that sort of how does that tie in, and what pleasures are actually seen as legitimate and what aren't within our frame of reference. So yeah.
Yeah, not surprising speaking to you two, that we've done a nice segue very quickly into pleasure and desire and away from a possible pathologizing way of talking about communities and persons. So I think what I'll do is I'll move. I know that each of you has a particular theoretical interests, and maybe I'll ask you to speak to those first, and then we'll move into a more broad-ranging discussion of pleasure again. So let's start, Ricky, if you don't mind, we'll start with you. You said you are studying psychodynamic theory and practice, correct?
Psychoanalysis.
Psychoanalysis, yes. Okay. Do you mind talking? I mean, I know it's a lot, but I know if you could give us a taste, beginners, of some concepts, some ideas that are compelling for you, especially as they tie to social change. And already you both sort of, if I might, have a kind of natural way to talk about broad social issues and social justice and social change, even as we're talking about personal change. So Ricky, if you could talk to us a little bit about your psychoanalytic approach.
So, I mean, I arrived at psychoanalysis in my late 20s. I started seeing an analyst for myself 4 times a week. And part of the reason why I was drawn to psychoanalysis is because it had this way of allowing me to understand some of my unconscious life. I mean, fundamentally, that's what psychoanalysis is. It's about the unconscious. It's about the things that inform us and stay with us from our past, from our personal history, from the intergenerational trauma, from our childhood, and that we carry with us all our lives into the world and into our relationships. And in my, when I was young, I became really interested in sort of how to make sense of myself as a visibly racialized, disabled, queer person, and how I understood myself, my body, how I understood my body as it moves through the world, how I understood other people perceiving me, and my racialized identity or my disability. And psychoanalysis became a way for me to really have a space to kind of unpack all of that with my analyst on a day-to-day basis, create a kind of narrative strand, you know, kind of tell my own story and have someone bear witness to that in the form of an analyst. You know, talk about things around my own kind of personal ideas about myself and my desires in a way that perhaps I never had the opportunity to articulate anywhere else. And that's part of the reason why I really belong to psychoanalysis. Because, you know, often psychoanalysis gets critiqued for being individualistic. And in the way it is, that critique is actually quite important to have because it's focused so much on the subjective and the personal and the individual, and not so much on like the masses or the collective or the community. But I feel how I approach psychoanalysis, both in my own analysis, but also in my own practice, is that it's a space, or it was a space, where I felt that I found my voice for the first time in my life, I would say. That I had someone that I feel I could narrate myself to in a way that perhaps I couldn't have done anywhere else. And that's how a lot of my clients also feel, is that, you know, people come to me and they talk to me about their lives and narrate their lives to me and talk about their personal anxieties, their fears, their desires, their pleasures, their joys, in ways that it might not do with anyone else in their lives. And so that, you know, for me, psychoanalysis is very, very much related to the question of creating a space for a person to have a sense of themselves as a vocal subject with something to say about themselves. So that's sort of a little kind of Cole's notes, kind of description of the psychoanalysis, but also that my own kind of investments in it, I suppose.
William, you want to build on that, or?
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, I think, I think what Ricky says is really beautiful and really gets to the heart of, I think, what a psychoanalytic practice could do, right? I think there's something really, really important about that, having a space in which you begin to be able to articulate both a sense of self and not self, right, at the same time. I think where Lacan comes in, where I think I've tended to kind of focus my scholarship more on work sort of inspired by Jacques Lacan, is that in many ways he pushes back against what's been taken up in the West as a kind of like ego psychology, right? He pushes back against the idea of the end goal of psychology being to sort of find the inner self, the inner child who can speak back, and instead actually talks about the self in a way that Ricky was talking about the self, right? As a product that's that's shifting, that's contextual, that has like feelings and emotions and affects and drives, but it's also constituted through like sets of discourses, right? And those discourses problematize and make our desires complicated. I would say we're like Lacanian, and psychoanalysis in general, I think is useful as like a broader social critique, is it allows us to think past discourses and also think through feeling and think through affect and think through our attachment to certain discourses. I would say, like, as someone who's still doing my PhD in social work, I would say, like, in the field of social work, we tend to kind of it seems like either position ourselves as clinical social workers, hence we're sort of rooted in the self, or, you know, we sort of do more broad-based like policy work, or like, you know, which is again sort of a more like social orientation. But the idea that the self is social and the social is self isn't actually sort of well brought together. And I feel where like a psychoanalytic approach does that. It actually, in really fundamental ways, kind of talks about the unconscious as being social. Like, there's a reason why, while we've been, for example, over the past quite a while now, while there's pushes, let's say, like against racism, right? And yet it gets reconstituted and reconstituted and reconstituted. So it's not just a matter of speaking, right? It's not just a matter of telling people. There's also a kind of affective orientation, right? A desire, a pleasure. So how can that be worked through? And I think that's the next step. There's more work. Yeah.
I actually want to add what Bill said. You know, for the audience, as you brought up later on, it's important to make the distinction between psychology and psychoanalysis, right? And then psychology often, that most psychology departments at most universities are very anti-psychoanalysis. And in fact, most social work departments at most universities are suspicious of psychoanalysis. And the reason why is that my understanding, this is an area of the Hole's note on this articulation of the distinction. Psychology is often about observable behavior. It's about, you know, fixing people. It's about kind of, you know, figuring out how to change behavior, shift how we and all of that. There is psychoanalysis, and Lacan is the one who actually said this. Psychoanalysis is about enjoying a symptom, as in, and that's his famous line, that, you know, you're not necessarily someone who has to be fixed. You're someone who has to be understood. That, you know, it's about how the unconscious has a way of making us relate to the world. You know, the self is a historical self, as in it's a self that has a long history that predates you. You know, and one example of that, and a very short example of that is that I can offer is that my own, you know, as a queer man, who is in his early 40s, who came out in the mid-90s, you know, a lot of my relationship with HIV/AIDS doesn't come from popular culture, but it comes from the fact that my grandfather, my father's father, my paternal grandfather, actually died of AIDS. But he is someone that I didn't actually have a relationship with. I didn't even know. I was born years after he had passed away. But the family history and how that family history and that knowledge of my grandfather having died of AIDS was passed down has a way in which it informs me and my present life. And that's what psychoanalysis does. It allows us to unpack our relationship to the past, our past. So, sorry.
I'd say too, just adding on to what Ricky is saying, I think that's, I also think that in my early life, I spoke only in Spanish, right? And then I started speaking English, and English became sort of my primary language. But living in two different languages, in many ways, I think shows us like how languages position us as thinking differently. Languages constitute sort of different ways of thinking in the world, and thereby constitute different kind of I would almost suggest like unconscious desires, like, which is what Lacan also says, right? That the unconscious is structured like language. So if the unconscious is structured like language, then different languages have different forms of unconsciousnesses. And for those of us who inhabit spaces where we have multiple languages or multiple contexts, we have those multiple unconscious desires happening within us, which make things complicated, but which speak back in a really fundamental way nicely to the complexity of what it means to be a subject in this world, in a way that what I would suggest is that a lot of more simple or more straightforward literature fails to do. Like it fails to kind of allow us to move to that place of grasping that.
Fantastic. William, it occurs to me, I've known you many years and I've never heard you speak Spanish. So
yeah. because you don't speak Spanish.
But there's also already some comments in the chat. I want to move us to pleasure. As usual, it's great to listen to you two talk to each other and talk amongst ourselves. But if we could move to pleasure. I know this is a broad question and maybe an unfair question, but what is pleasure? And if that's too broad a question, then what does it look like? What do you imagine it looks like? Do you want to go first, William?
Sure. So it's funny. So in thinking about this question, I thought first of how, because we're also talking about psychoanalytic theory. So I was like, oh, well, how does pleasure sort of fit into psychoanalytic theory, right? And how does pleasure fit into Lacan? And pleasure in terms of Lacan is really it almost seems this kind of intermediary stage, this place of like a kind of good, right? It's like there's a pleasure principle. We desire pleasure. Pleasure is good for us, so we desire it. But pleasure also keeps us from that place of a kind of excess of pleasure, which is what he then terms as jouissance, which is no longer necessarily pleasurable. It's a type of excess. So I would say that I'm not talking about this kind of mediated form of well-being, a kind of like general goodness. But I am actually interested a little bit in, I think my more recent research and some of the work that I've done in the past is, a lot of it's really been around like sexuality and around sex and around thinking about pleasure and what has sort of been considered a kind of excess of pleasure. I think as queer men, I think often we are imagined as almost having a kind of excess of pleasure. And when we engage in certain types of activities, bareback sex, S&M, group sex, sex with toys, like a whole range of things, it's almost written as a kind of excessiveness and something to be constrained and held back or to be monitored. So I'm actually interested in that kind of pleasure. I'm interested in the kind of pleasure that that seems almost excessive, but also is a place of real connection. There's a reason that, and sex only as like a focal point. There's many focal points. I think you can get to this through like dancing. You can get to this through like different sort of like communitarian activities or religious activities. There's ways of kind of getting to this place of like an undoing of the self. and a re-becoming something greater, which I think is really just really beautiful. Yeah, so I think that's what I'm thinking. I sort of went around it, but that's
Yeah.
what I'm thinking in terms of pleasure.
Just before I ask Ricky as well, it seems to me even the undoing of self can be a pleasure. You know, especially, how can I word it? If it's a social self that's burdened with expectations of a particular type that aren't welcoming to oneself, just undoing all that becomes a pleasure in its own right. Yeah. Ricky, what do you think about pleasure?
You know, I feel that, you know, how I approach pleasure is very similar to how Bill was talking about it. I feel that, you know, in a way that you can't talk about pleasure without talking about desire. And there's, you know, and desire for me is about some kind of satiation, some kind of fulfillment, some kind of need to be satisfied. And as Bill was saying, you know, that need to be satisfied can come in so many different forms, right? It can be about surviving from day to day, being able to pay the bills, and, you know, put food on the table, to more transcendental forms of pleasure that come from, let's say, religious ecstasy, or the spiritual, you know, awakening and whatnot. I do, you know, let Bill, you know, more recently, in the last couple of years, I've been writing a lot about sex and pornography. I'm really interested in the visualization of like sex and the representation of sex in the form of porn. And you know, I'm always curious about, in the context of porn, I'm always curious about why people watch or consume what they watch. And like, ultimately, it speaks to something about their desire. And I'm really interested in kind of unpacking that with them if the opportunity kind of arises. I do, you know, one thing I will say about pleasure, and this is kind of pleasure more broadly defined, is that I think it's really important to also, you know, have conversations about pleasure be polite and kind of have it in this kind of present moment. That so much of it is mediated by capitalism and consumerism and quick fixes and access to, you know, immediate gratification. And while that can be pleasurable, I'm not saying it isn't, and it can be. I think it's important to kind of disentangle pleasure from capitalism and consumerism, and kind of really look at pleasure as something very, very subjective and very, very personal. And really kind of hold to a much greater depth in trying to understand, you know, what is each one of us pleasure in our lives, outside of capital.
I'm very interested in this notion and of overcoding pleasure or reinterpreting pleasure as something else, and I think capital does that really readily. Expressions of pleasure, you know, I mean, in the obvious way, they become products very quickly, or more desire, more pleasure, more, you want more, you know. even though pleasure is satiation, which I love that notion, and I think can be healing, we're kind of in a moment where it also plays on our pleasure, right? Where there's never enough.
Mhm.
Is that fair? Is that sounding too?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's, yeah, it is, you know, the thing about capitalism is that it's almost a pie contest. There is a law for eating pie is more pie.
Like that.
And it's almost nothing is enough. No, there is no limit to what we can have access to the means that are available to us, depending on each of our needs. I wonder about that and what it means to kind of understand pleasure from that perspective. Even in the context of my own practice, like my therapeutic practice, you know, I have clients who come in my sessions and come into sessions with me saying, I don't want to talk about anything sad. I don't want to talk about what pains me. This is difficult. I want therapy to be fun. And I want looking at myself to be fun. But I often have to kind of remind them that, you know, it's work. Therapeutic work is not easy. It's painful, it's difficult. Self-awareness is not supposed to be pleasurable. I mean, it can be pleasurable, as you said, despite that, you know, and you said that there is a kind of pleasure that comes from a kind of undoing. And I wonder about how we might be able to really kind of come closer to that. And look at pleasure from a perspective that is really about not satisfying our needs right away, but sitting with our desires for a little longer before having them be satisfied. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. William, did you want to?
Yeah, no, I've been thinking about pleasure's relation to capital, right? And what you've been talking about in terms of like how, of course, like capital and capitalism and the moment we're in of sort of hyper consumption, it circumscribes pleasure, it mediates pleasure, it creates pleasure, right? So it actually constitutes forms of pleasure, and in doing that, it actually creates a kind of alignment towards certain types of pleasure, meaning it constitutes us in really fundamental ways. So I do think the question that Ricky raises, and I think I think it popped up actually in the chat box around alternative, like what different alternatives could be, alternative structures toward developing or thinking through pleasure. Like those are deeply important right now. Right, so thinking through like even if I think of like my work in the past, I know one of the things that we did at I worked at the Attic Youth Center in Philadelphia, which was a queer youth center, and monthly we had balls, right? So we would have like a ball like every month, right? So that ball was like a place of speaking back, of pleasure, of community, of possibility, of world making, right? Which was alternative and outside of capital. So how do those spaces get like reconstituted? How do those spaces get like taken up and rethought and reimagined and sort of put back out in the world so that it's seen, so that people see this as a possibility? But even that in and of itself, being put back out in the world, means they're now in the in the crosshairs of capital, right? So it becomes complicated. But it's an important project, right? I think like to be able to kind of think through and sort of beyond capital, or to use capital for the moment, and then in order to kind of allow for structures to get put into place for us to kind of move a social justice framework further ahead, even though I know we also all have problems with and wanted to trouble like the idea of social justice, but even so, to put sort of different possibilities forward for like types of pleasures and types of joys, right? Because I think that's integral.
I think, if I might, I'm quite excited. I recognize names in our audience. I'd like to, we can continue discussion, but let's also open it up. Could we do that at this point? Are you good with that? So Luke, can you make sure people can also access their videos if they want to ask their question? So I'm encouraging people to either through the chat or either hands up and video, or not video, but hands up and verbal, also engage in the discussion with us. While we're waiting, I got thinking of billionaires going to space, straight billionaires going to space. And somehow it just occurred to me when you were talking, both of you, that somehow we're supposed to enjoy their pleasure, and somehow their pleasure is tantamount, and we're all supposed to be really excited over that. So this necessity for these alternative expressions of pleasure. Do you want to comment on that, or? No?
Ricky, do you want to comment?
Never mind. You just got me thinking.
I have very little opinion about billionaires.
Okay. And we don't need to bring them in. But still, it just occurs to me.
I just, it exists in a reality that is not real, per se. It's in a very different reality in most of us, if not all of us. So,
yeah. Okay. I see there's a question from Aaron there. Can you see it, Ricky?
Yeah, I just responded. I just finished my training at the Toronto Institute of Psychoanalysis. I saw a question before that by a tweet. And I think you have your mute.
I'm sorry, there's background noise here, so I muted. Akib, I saw your hand is up. Do you want to speak?
Hey, hello, sir. Well, Ricky was about to say something. I'll take a moment because I might change the subject or the question, but no, if you want,
go ahead.
Well, for Mr. William addressing my question, he was kind of saying that the act of congregation kind of gives that opportunity to kind of navigate the pleasure. And from what Ms. Ricky was saying was that from what I gathered was because I wrote the question, I sent the question in the middle of what you were saying, but you're in the journey of kind of asking these hard deal questions of how to communicate, how to dissect what the current pleasure indicators are as people access porn, which is kind of a real deal, because it's like when the people that you're attracted to, they're not around you, then it's kind of like it's an empty place. and the urges kind of easily take you towards an addiction, right? So I worry about it. I just wanted to highlight that. And then I wanted to emphasize on structural pleasure, because you just mentioned, Dr. Moffat, that the billionaires, they went so much more towards space, but they can't understand how $6 billion could help the FAO impact the world a lot more helpfully, right? That's problematic, but that's structurally what they are now more programmed to do, because we have places like Ethiopia or Afghanistan where there's these oppressors who are more structurally willing to use their guns than to go into a stalemate, to go into a sense of ceasefire, to apologize. Like, that is so difficult. And what I wanted to basically highlight is that our pleasures are stop our accountability. And I just wanted to highlight that in case, and kind of hear your inputs on that. Well, how can we combine those two? How can we make those two more possible so we can achieve accountability, go into towards healing and reconciliation and balance? Thank you.
Thanks, Akib. And Akib, don't call me Dr. Moffat. We know each other. Just want to correct that formality, but I appreciate it. I know that's hi, Akib. Nice to see you. Okay, do you want to talk to Akib's comment? And then Elizabeth also has a very interesting question in the chat.
Sure. I think there were a number of questions sort of embedded like within that, which I think were interesting. I'd kind of like to go back actually. So Akib, you mentioned this, and Ken, you mentioned the billionaires in space, right? And I do think where the billionaires in space are interesting is I do think that in some really fundamental ways, that kind of imagery is actually meant to produce a kind of desire among a set of masses, right? It's meant to produce a kind of naturalization of that, which then pushes us away from the kind of social responsibility that Akib is talking about, right? I think it's very purposeful, right, that's happening. I feel what was probably less purposeful is the fact that there was so much speaking back against that. I think that was probably unexpected. And that may be because of the moment we're in, that may be because Donald Trump just got out of office, right? That may be sort of a whole host of things. But that type of like hyper consumption is again sort of embedded within these spaces that we inhabit, right? If you go on Instagram, so much of it is around like people consuming, right? And showing off their consumption, and that becomes sort of a place of desire and a place of like of pleasure. I would caution against positioning pleasure on one side and social justice on the other. I think that tends to actually like reconstitute forms of delegitimation of like certain bodies, certain desires, certain peoples. I think queer people in general have been delegitimated like from the get-go, right? In relation to desires we have toward those we're not supposed to desire, and in doing actions we're not supposed to like to do. So I think that's something to think through. Yeah, a little bit more.
I want to add to a conversation about the billionaires. The thing is that as it was happening, as we were watching, Jeff Bezos blow up into space, I was fascinated by how much we have become a society that's a spectacle. I mean, we've always been a society that's a spectacle, but how naturalized it has become is just come to accept the spectacle as a site of pleasure. And I was so fascinated by the response Because on the one hand, there were people who were celebrating what was happening, and on the other hand, there were people who were, obviously criticizing and like, trying to kind of speak that or push that against this. And I feel that I would argue that these responses are built into how we are expected to respond to events like this. And that's why initially I was like, I don't want to talk about billionaires because I actually don't want to give them any more air. Right? Because I feel like if I talk about them, I would be participating in this kind of like spectacle. And it's not that I don't want to acknowledge the spectacle. It's not that I want to look away. It's that I feel that in this contemporary moment, for it, as much as celebration is a built-in feature of the spectacle. And that sort of, you can see that on social media platforms, as Lily was saying, you go on Instagram and you see people consuming things, and it's all about showcasing what you're consuming. And one of the things that's been consumed is social justice. People are constantly sharing, what protests they're going to, what visuals they're going to. It's all about revealing yourself as a virtuous, righteous person. And that in and of itself is a form of consumption. And again, it is what it is. And I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. It is what it is. It's the system that we find ourselves in. But I think we need to be aware of it and cognizant of what's happening as these events kind of play out.
That's great. There's a nice question from Elizabeth and also one from Aaron in the chat. Maybe I'll read it out in case some people can't read the chat. So from Elizabeth Sargent, why do we think pleasure is so discouraged when it comes to politics and community organization?
I think that's a great question. I think it really depends on our definition of pleasure. And I think that's actually where it gets a little bit tricky. Because I do think that in our fields of like social work or helping professions, we often do engage in kind of social movement making, which has aspects of pleasure, right, embedded within it, a type of like communitarianism, a type of like of coming together, a type of identification, a kind of like a production of sharing food, of joy, like all of that's embedded within that. I would suggest, though, that in our field, what we're afraid of is an excess of pleasure. What we're afraid of is a kind of pleasure that's not respectable. So that speaks back to, I think, something that Ricky and I have like talked about before, and that he just talked about, right? A kind of like a respectability politic. So what does it mean, and how, like, so the question again around why our fields, I think, are like, don't sort of want to engage in like conversations around pleasure is, I would suggest, around a fear of an excess of pleasure. And some of that's around what communities you bring to do what things, and how can you circumscribe those things, right? I think having worked in the HIV/AIDS field for as long as I have, I've very clearly seen how certain people are privileged in terms of being able to access conversations and resources for things that other people aren't, right? There's a reason why infection rates are higher in certain communities than others, right? There's a reason why certain communities tend to be healthier than others in terms of in terms of access to resources, in terms of access to power, right? So, and that's connected to a respectability politic. Yeah.
I kind of want to echo everything that those said. I kind of want to address the question about pleasure as resistance, because I learned that was something that Bill said a little while ago. Some communities have never been allowed to have legitimate access to pleasure. There are communities, various racialized communities, people with disabilities are oftentimes not allowed to access pleasure or even feel desired, or feel that it can be desirable. And so pleasure as resistance is about really kind of, being able to admit that those of us who are on the margins can feel desire and pleasure as well. That we have every right to do so. That pleasure is not or should not be about privilege or forms of privilege. But there are also other ways in which pleasure comes up as resistance. And, one way in which I think of that is, freedom, to be free, to be free of state violence, to be a free, emancipated subject. There's pleasure in that. There's pleasure in being able to be free of forms of historical violence that communities have been subjected to. And I think, while freedom for some is often taken granted, for many of us, freedom is inaugural moment when we're able to actually feel some sort of pleasure. If that makes sense. So.
Beautiful, if I might say. William, did you want to say any more about pleasure as resistance?
No, I honestly, like, I really love what Ricky said. I think it's
Yeah, me too.
Nothing to add.
The very and also just to add a little bit, just the very act of resistance can be an act of pleasure. It's not, separate realities necessarily. Erin, did you want to say anything else? I just see you in agreement there. I just want to give you the opportunity.
Oh, hi. No, I don't have anything else, but thank you so much for answering my questions. Very stimulating discussion.
I would like to say as well, I think one of the things that I really appreciate Ricky's last comment as well around, because I think that really showed sort of the linkages between pleasure, as in like bodily pleasure, as in what we consider personal pleasure, and the social, right? And how the social also kind of like produces the conditions to kind of allow for personal pleasure. And the social in and of itself can be central to not only experiencing pleasure, but can actually be pleasurable in and of itself. I think what I've like talked about, I think a fair bit today, even though a lot of my research has been on sex and hasn't really been about the communal. And in a lot of ways, I've been talking about the communal today, but the personal and the communal overlap, because the social and the personal sort of, they're embedded within each other, right? They collapse into each other. The whole little Morpheus thing. Yeah, so that was really lovely. So thank you. I think it was good.
Anybody else? Any other comments? We are coming close to the end. But there still is time if anybody wants to make any more comments or has any questions or things to add. And in the meantime, do you have any, oh, here we are, Elizabeth Sargent again. How can Rice students implement this into their own lives? That's a very interesting question. Thank you, Elizabeth. I think it's very interesting. Does anybody want to take it? I could start by saying perhaps, oh, it's a tough question because then you're speaking for someone else's pleasure, I guess, right? But I think part of it is being clear what your pleasure is and to fully enjoy it and embrace it is what I would say.
I would say so I would say as well, sorry, did I cut you off? Because I didn't mean to do that.
No, not at all.
Okay.
I do have some background noise, so I have to mute. So I'm conscious of it. Yeah.
So one of the things to add on to that is I mean what we've all really been talking about significantly is this overlap between the social and the individual, right? So part of that as well, and I think again, I think Lacan is especially kind of useful in like thinking through this. Is it in many ways he argues, and those who follow him like argue that the individual is in many ways sort of made up through the social, right? The individual, like our unconscious is the result of language, and language is a result of like of generational processes, but also individuals and how they take up language and how they're institutionalized, how we relate to each other. Given that we are embedded in the social, that the social is actually sort of part of our very unconscious, we have a responsibility to each other, right? So our own pleasure also means we have a responsibility to those around us, and we have a responsibility towards supporting their pleasure. I think that's where it moves beyond this idea of the atomized individual, and instead becomes around sort of thinking through and politicizing for spaces of like joy and possibility and creation, in many ways as spaces that speak back to our current moment, or that build on the current moment. It's not always about, you know, about speaking back to wrong, but also about building on a right? But that responsibility to the other is connected to the fact that none of us individually are an individual, that we're embedded in each other. And that I think is really critical to like Lacanian psychoanalytic theory.
I mean, you know, I think that it's idea, you know, the idea about pleasure is that pleasure is always in relation to something or someone, right? Even in the context of an analytic session, you know, I remember in my analysis that years ago that just human, you know, analysis oftentimes feels individual or atomized, but it is a relationship. It's a relationship that you have with yourself, but it's also a relationship that you have with the analyst. And, you know, there is something to be said about being seen, being recognized, more than just being seen, but being recognized for who you are. And that recognition can only, the pleasure of that recognition can only come in the context of social relations, whether it is in the analytic office or whether it is in the context of your respective communities or the classrooms or whatnot, or family relationships or friendships or whatnot. There is something to be said about the fact that we always think of pleasure as always being about relationships that we have with others, and how those relationships inform our sense of self as well.
We are coming to the end. Thank you so much. I see people are already having to move on for the next thing. But I did want to say something about, yeah, the importance of being seen, and also the importance of seeing people in their pleasure and having some enjoyment with that, even if it doesn't look like our own, you know. I think there's something there as well. I would like to give you a moment for final comments, each of you. Ricky, do you want to go first? Just if you have any final comments before we go.
I mean, I just want to thank Ken and Lillian for this very stimulating conversation. And I also want to thank the audience for coming out. These conversations are especially important in this time of isolation, I feel. And I appreciate the opportunity to really kind of work my thought muscles. Yeah, I mean, that's all I have to say.
William.
So also, I'd like to thank you, Ken, for inviting me, and Ricky for this. I think this was really pleasurable. Like I enjoyed this, and I like being able to. I think this kind of conversation is really productive, and it's productive sort of given the fields that we work in that often don't focus enough, I think, on pleasure and on joy and on possibility, and don't sort of look at those intersections. Thank you everyone who came. I'm like just really kind of blown away, and you had like really great questions. Yeah, this is really lovely. So so thank you. And yeah, and Ken and Ricky, we should get together at some point.
Yes. You took the words out of my mouth. That this was pleasurable. I wanted to, it's just great to hear you two and your thinking and the conversation and the thoughtfulness. So thank you so much. And thank you again. I was quite excited by our audience, knowing a number of people from a whole variety of settings that showed up today. And I really appreciate it. So thanks, and we will.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.